Hey everybody, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Agenda, and this is the history of the world. The year is now 1900 BCE. In the last century, the Indus River Valley civilization began to collapse. China entered the Bronze Age in earnest. Mesopotamia more or less remained in a state of warring chaos, and Egypt enjoyed a golden age under the Middle Kingdom. As we reach 1900, we're about to witness a potentially decisive clash between Isin and Larsa for dominance in Mesopotamia. Now, I don't really have any major general development notes for this century as far as technology goes or anything like that, so let's jump straight into the political situation in Mesopotamia. Isin was the initial major successor to the third dynasty of sometimes called the Neo-Sumerian Empire, which fell a little over a century ago now. But it's recently been challenged by the rise of Larsa to the south, ruled by an Amorite dynasty. You may recall that the Amorites were the nomadic invading people most responsible for the fall of By now, they've begun to really heavily assimilate into the area, become settled, and take over the rule of cities in their own right, and so on. But Isin ruled Nippur, and other cities only a few decades ago, and it has recently retaken Nippur under its long-reigning usurper king Ur-Ninurta, following the death of the first king of Larsa, Gunungan. But Gunungan's successor Abasare can't let the recapture of Nippur stand, and Ur-Ninurta attempts to keep his momentum up and advance south along the Euphrates after retaking Nippur. The two sides meet in about 1896 at Adab. We don't know any details whatsoever of the resulting, presumably, battle, but the army of Larsa is apparently victorious. Ur-Ninurta is either killed on the field or shortly after dies, but Abasare isn't really able to follow up. He dies within the next 2 years himself, after a reign of about 11 years. And that leaves the situation not really resolved, but rather fading into maybe not quite a stalemate, but more or less a stalemate, a very long, drawn-out affair. Those two kings are followed by these two. On the left, Bur-Sin of Isin. On the right, Sumu-El of Larsa, or rather a dog statue dedicated to the gods in his name as an offering for his good health. But that's a minor detail. Bur-Sin takes the throne in about 1896 or 95 and rules Isin for 21 years. Sumu-El takes the throne in 1894 and rules Larsa for 29 years. During those decades, the kingdoms remain almost constantly, perhaps not at war, but in a state of very hostile competition. There's evidence for a lot of continuous building, filling in, and rerouting canals, competing over sort of trying to cut off each other's water supplies. Fierce competition over water for agriculture, which is a big issue in Mesopotamia, has been for centuries already, only getting worse with their salinification problems and just the sheer population density. The water is ultimately kind of limited. It seems like control of Nippur and the Temple of Enlil, which is religiously vital, basically a holy city, goes back and forth over the course of the rivalry. Bur-Sin dies in about 1873 and is succeeded by Lipit Enlil, who has a short reign, only about 5 years, not much known about it, and he dies before Sumu-El does even, and is succeeded by Era-Emiti, who reigns about 8 years. He apparently retakes Nippur for Isin, which hard to say how many times they've won and lost it leading up to that, and also the city of Kasura, which is an ally of Larsa, and then allegedly dies while drinking hot soup. Meanwhile, in Larsa, Sumu-El has by then been followed by Nur-Adad, who reigns for 16 years. To be very clear, neither Isin nor Larsa, I'm focusing on them, but neither of them rules anything like all of Mesopotamia. They're probably the most powerful and the best documented dynasties in the most densely populated core Sumerian region, but there's a lot of other cities and small civilizations on the periphery, such as Mari and Elam, and Assyria is beginning to come into its own. It's not huge yet. and nor do they really even assert definitive authority over all of the states within the core Sumerian region, or all of the cities, that is. But so far as their rivalry goes, Ere'miti dies in 1861 and is succeeded by Enlil Bani, who reigns for 24 years. This here is one of his foundation cones. I believe I've mentioned them in previous episodes. They're made to be inserted into the walls or foundations of new buildings as a sort of dedication marker to the gods, or acknowledging the king's sponsorship in this case, basically. Now, Enlil Bani might come to the throne via usurpation. I mentioned the legend where Ere'miti dies by drinking hot soup. This is sort of a weird legend. Allegedly, he placed Enlil Bani, who was a gardener, physically on the throne as a ruse in an attempt to avoid a prophecy of the king's death, and then died anyway while drinking his porridge or his soup or something. This might be a cover-up for Enlil Bani's coming to the throne by some kind of nefarious means, but it's impossible to say for sure. In any case, it doesn't really matter. He's a fairly good king, it seems like. This particular foundation cone is actually from the walls of Isin, which he refurbishes as they'd fallen into some disrepair. He builds other temples, statues, buildings. He's got a pretty long and prosperous reign. And over in Larsa, Nur-Adad dies in about 1850 and is succeeded by Sin-Idanam, who campaigns against various other cities, including Babylon, which is starting to grow in strength and become a bit of a player in the region by this time. Sin-Idanam dies after a 7-year reign, is followed by Sin-Erebam, who rules only 2 or 3 years, then Sin-Ikisham, who campaigns against Elam, wins a victory over the new king of Isin. Speaking of which, new king in Isin, Enlil Bani, dies in about 1837 and is succeeded by Zambia, who is really only remembered for being defeated by Sin-Ikisham and then dies after 2 or 3 years on the throne. Is succeeded by Iterpisa, who rules about 3 years, is followed by Erdukugu, who rules 4 years and is succeeded by Suin-Magir. You may have noticed this series of kings is not lasting very long, and Isin is not doing well by this point. They rule little more than Isin and the holy city of Nippur by this point. Larsa is definitively stronger. In fairness, Larsa is not that stable for a little period here either. The throne of Larsa passes from Sin-Ikishim after only about 5 years, and his successor Sili-Adad rules less than a year before being succeeded by Warad Sin. Warad Sin, however, lasts a bit longer, reigning for 11 years, during which he defeats at least one invading army and destroys the walls of Kazalu. So, as we reach about 1822 BCE, this is by the middle chronology, incidentally. I've consistently, to the best of my ability, used the middle chronology throughout this series, but you should be aware that there are technically at least 5 competing chronologies for this entire time period, at least in Mesopotamia, based around various astronomical events and other independently datable phenomena, which we believe we have records of, salvaged from the ancient records. And that's how we get precise dates for pretty much any of this, but it's not that certain, hence the 5 different competing chronologies. But the middle chronology seems to be the most popular these days, so continuing to go by that one, as I have stuck with. In about 1822, Warad Sin is succeeded by his brother Rim-Sin I. Now, Rim-Sin is apparently still a pretty young ruler, and he proves to be a vigorous one. He expands the influence and power of Larsa, which is, of course, pretty much continuously waxed and waned over the last century. This here is a foundation figurine or nail of him, basically a variation on the cone. He apparently even takes Nippur from Isin at some point, although control of it, of course, has gone back and forth several times. Meanwhile, in Isin, Suin-Magir dies after a 10-year reign and is followed by Damik Elishu, who retakes Nippur once again. Events finally start to take a decisive turn in 1808, when Rim-Sin's expansionism apparently alarms his neighbors enough that a coalition of Isin, Uruk, and Babylon forms against him. Babylon now under their leader Sin-Muballit, who has a newborn son by the name of Hammurabi. But that's not really relevant yet. It's not Babylon's time, as it turns out. Rim-Sin I defeats the coalition, sacks Uruk, doesn't sack Babylon or Isin yet, but by 1800, Isin is practically just controlling the city of Isin itself, and under constant threat from Larsa. Rim-Sin I has achieved dominance of most of the Sumerian heartland for Larsa, even if he doesn't have that final victory over Isin yet, and honestly, plenty of other cities don't really recognize his authority either, including Babylon, which has become an increasingly significant city and a major regional player by this point, although not quite in the league of Larsa on its own yet. So, sum up Mesopotamia for this century. A century of constant feuding between Isin and Larsa, plus numerous other cities and states. More than I can really reasonably go into during an episode of the sort of length we're targeting here. Although also details for pretty much all of them are very scarce, so I don't feel too bad about excluding most of them. But there is Mari, there is Elam, there's Assyria starting to be a thing. They now have a new Amorite king of their own, and have established a small kingdom in Upper Mesopotamia, but they will be short-lived in that iteration, so. Aside from that, the Amorites, as I've mentioned, have more or less integrated into and pretty much rule the area. Isin and Babylon, among others, Assyria, all ruled by Amorite dynasties by this point. By contrast, Egypt has a pretty good century. In 1900, the Middle Kingdom is ruled by Amenemhat II, who's reigned for a quarter century already. Not a terribly active quarter century, he's not that well attested to. But he has numerous children, and when he dies in about 1890, and is buried at his White Pyramid in Dashur, which is now ruined due to quarrying it for stone, he's succeeded by his son, Senusret II. Senusret II here is a peaceful ruler, more or less. He inaugurates a major project to develop the Fayum Oasis, which is a large oasis sort of west of the Nile, south of what would have then been Memphis and now would be Cairo. He builds an extensive irrigation system, diverts water to use as a reservoir to expand Egypt's useful agricultural land, and the place becomes a major center for the pharaoh's power, almost a resort-like type of air. I mean, it's a bit swampy, but you do what you can. And notably, he does choose to build his pyramid near there at El Lahun, although his is also mostly ruined. Overall, Senusret II rules about 15 years in a time of what's considerable prosperity for the Middle Kingdom. I mean, you'll note everything I have to say about his realm is basically building and expansion, which is always a good thing. He takes at least 2 wives, Kenemet Neferhedjet I and Nofret II, probably also Itaweret and Kenmet, all of whom are also his sisters, as is traditional in Egypt, and he has at least 5 children. Although only one really matters. He dies in probably 1878 and is succeeded by his son, Senusret III. Senusret III here is a much more warlike ruler than his father. He probably takes about 3 wives, Neferthenut, Kenemet Neferhedjet II, don't ask me to spell that, and Idikate, and possibly also a Merit Sager, not definitely. Most probably these are his sisters, but we're not certain on that either. He does have at least 5 children, probably more. In non-warlike activities, he does build a canal to bypass the first cataract of the Nile, although that's probably in support of his military activities. He continues his father's projects around the Fayum Oasis, builds a substantial 78-meter pyramid at Dashur, and he may have considered building a canal from the Red Sea to the Nile, according to later legends. If so, he gave up due to fears of the salt water contaminating the Nile. But we have no hard contemporary evidence for him considering that. He is best remembered for his military campaigns, though, mainly in the first half of his reign. At least 4 times he campaigns into Nubia, pushing Egypt's borders significantly further south, although the final campaign is a failure due to the level of the Nile dropping and almost stranding his army. Still, he evidently expands Egypt to a greater size than ever before. He also campaigns at least once into the Levant and Syria, the first Egyptian military expedition that has definitely gone well past the Sinai. Some others may have in the past, but he definitely makes it all the way into the Levant and Syria. Not to any permanent end, but a general matter of raiding and extracting tribute. He also after the first 20 years or so, he pretty much settles into his newly won borders, and he reigns another 20 years in collaboration with his son as a co-regency, probably, dying in 1839 after just shy of 40 years on the throne, at which point he is succeeded fully by his son, Amenemhat III. Amenemhat III takes wives including At, Neferhadjet III, and possibly Hetepti, and has potentially up to 6 or more children, although most of them are not certain. He probably shares a co-regency with his father for about the first 20 years of his reign, overlapping with the last 20 years of his father's. This is not disputed, well, this is disputed and is not certain, though. If you don't think that it happened, then the turnover point between the two should be taken usually to be about 20 years earlier than 1839. However exactly it happened, Egypt is peaceful and stable under Amenemhat and his father. They've pretty much reined in the power of the nomarchs at this point. The pharaohs exercise strong authority over the kingdom. As I mentioned, Amenemhat is not particularly warlike, unlike his father. He campaigns little, if at all, but he does build. Oh, how he builds. The exploitation of the Sinai mines for turquoise and copper peaks under his reign. Many other mines are in full production across Egypt. He builds numerous temples, a very large temple of Sobek, who is a crocodile god very much in vogue in Egypt at the moment. At least 2 40-foot statues of himself, that's about 12 meters. He continues the extensive building and irrigation project around Fayum, which is pretty much matures and is fully successful under his reign. He builds 2 great pyramids for himself, the first in Sneferu to build 2, the Black Pyramid at Dashur, and the Pyramid of Hawara near the Fayum Oasis, although both are mostly ruined now, and a smaller pyramid for his daughter Neferupta. He reigns something on the order of 25 years after his father's death, and the Middle Kingdom is pretty much at its absolute peak under Amenemhat III. This is pretty much a golden era of building and prosperity for Egypt, no signs of major violence, lots of new construction. He's succeeded in about 1815 by his probable son, Amenemhat IV, after a brief co-regency. Amenemhat IV's reign is in itself not exceptional. He keeps exploiting the turquoise mines, he trades with Byblos in the Levant, and dispatches an expedition to Punt. He completes or builds various temples. Pretty much does the things expected of the pharaoh, none of them really exceptional, but all of them seemingly competent and successful enough. Everything keeps on ticking. There is by this point starting to be a bit of a problem of Asiatic immigration into the Nile Delta. As I've mentioned before, the Egyptians pretty much called everyone east of the Sinai Asiatic, which of course is technically geographically true, but really generic, so we're not exactly sure who these people are, but it doesn't seem like either he's unable to or he just doesn't care to check this. It's probably not an issue at this point, so long as the Middle Kingdom is stable and powerful. So long as the Middle Kingdom is stable and powerful, because when Amenemhat IV dies, after just over 9 years on the throne, in about 1806, things come crashing down with quite astonishing speed, actually. We're not sure if Amenemhat IV has any male issue or not. It's not terribly clear, but if he does, they must be too young to take power, or for some reason otherwise unable to do so, because his successor is his probable sister, and or wife, probably Sobek Neferu. She adopts the full royal titulary for herself, doesn't make any claim of ruling in the name of some young male heir or anything. She crowns herself fully as pharaoh, and takes a regnal name associated with Sobek, which really reinforces the growing importance of that god's cult at this point. It is absolutely clear that she does rule Egypt in her own right, which she's the first woman to definitively rule Egypt in her own right and not as a regent. But her reign is not a long one, probably not a happy one. She holds the throne for only a bit over 3 years and dies in about 1803. In your real classical sign of things are not going well, we're not even sure who her successor is for sure. It's either Sobek Hotep I or Wagaf, probably. In fact, the kingdom may be fracturing already by the time of her death. Sobek Hotep is probably the leading candidate for new pharaoh, and if he is, he may also be one of the sons of Amenemhat IV if they exist. Note the number of ifs in that sentence. They might be old enough, theoretically, to take the throne now, or just nobody is standing in their way. Either way, Sobek Hotep is considered the founder of the 13th dynasty, but despite the long period of peace under the 12th dynasty leading up to the 13th dynasty, the 13th dynasty seems immediately unable to really achieve stability in the kingdom and the succession, and probably as we reach 1800, Egypt is just facing major internal challenges. The kingdom might actually be actively split already, but it's probably Sobek Hotep I that holds the throne as we reach 2800, albeit in a much more chaotic fashion than his predecessors. A few other minor notes for this century. I don't have any major developments of significance to report in the Indus or China or America, unfortunately. But in about 1825, we do see this text produced, which is the oldest known Egyptian medical text. Interestingly, it's essentially a gynecological text. It contains diagnosis and treatment for various concerns of the reproductive system, and pregnancy and fertility advice, and contraceptive treatments, although they involve crocodile dung and honey, and overall are probably not to be recommended by the sound of it. But their very existence is some interesting proof of very early efforts into birth control by humans, even if, well, I don't know. Crocodile dung might be able to make you infertile, it just doesn't sound very sanitary. In any case, as we reach 1800, the world's political situation has probably gotten worse in the last century, if we're being honest. At this point, Larsa is close to defeating Isin in Samaria, but it's been a century of feuding, and even if Larsa does finally destroy Isin, it's not particularly close to uniting all of Mesopotamia once again. The region has pretty much been split between small feuding kingdoms for over 2 centuries, and even the Neo-Sumerians, or Third Ur, were a bit of a shadow of the glory of the Akkadian Empire. Egypt has enjoyed almost a full century of peace in the last century, but the 12th dynasty has come to a rather abrupt end, and the 13th immediately appears to be failing to really keep a control of the country. The Indus Valley civilization's collapse is pretty well advanced by now as well, so it's really only China that things are going pretty well in. The Nordic-Chico civilization in the Americas we will get to next episode, but things aren't going well there either, so will civilization put itself back together a little more in the next century? Will someone unite those feuding states in Mesopotamia? Will Egypt weather this crisis, or is the Middle Kingdom doomed to collapse like the old? Subscribe, and then tune in next century to find out.